Hello and welcome to Web of Tomorrow. I'm Adam Garrett Harris, and today I'm talking with Richard Feldman, author of Elm in Action. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I saw you talk at Framework Summit.
Oh yeah,
that was a really cool talk where you just described Elm, of course, and we got to see talks from lots of other different front end frameworks. And I saw your front end master's course, and I thought it was really, really cool.
Oh,
the
thanks.
way you were teaching and how you were just so excited about it. And that really drew me to Elm even maybe more than the language itself.
Wow. Well, thank you. That's that's very kind of you to say.
And so, yeah, I wanted to talk to you on here because I'm interested in what you do and what Elm is all about. And your book just came out pretty recently, right?
Yeah, I think in April.
Yeah.
So a few months.
So what is your book all about in a nutshell?
So Elm in Action is essentially a book that's aimed at people who have no experience with Elm, no experience with functional programming, and perhaps no experience with web development, although it does assume a little bit of like web basics like HTML and CSS. But even if you don't really know web development, you can probably get through the book okay, except for the chapter on JavaScript interop, which of course assumes you know some stuff about JavaScript, but that's only one of the chapters. And the goal of the book is to teach Elm in the context of building an application. So the first chapter is basically about basic syntax and stuff, kind of the nuts and bolts that you need to know any language. And then every other chapter is about building an application from start to finish. So in the second chapter, you build the beginnings of the app, and then every chapter after that, you add on features to the app or make changes to it. And in the course of doing that, you're learning more and more about the language until by the end of it, you have a complete working single page app that talks to servers, it does JavaScript interop, and sort of you're ready to go and make your own Elm applications.
Awesome. Is that what the In Action series is generally like, where you're building something?
Yeah, not necessarily an application, but in action generally means it's focused on sort of practical applications as opposed to, for example, theory. This is definitely not a theory book.
Yeah, and what is Elm?
So Elm is a pure functional programming language that compiles to JavaScript. So where you've got like TypeScript and Dart and CoffeeScript, all of which are similar enough to JavaScript that I think they can reasonably be called JavaScript dialects in the case of TypeScript and well, I guess CoffeeScript and Dart, maybe you could say those are not JavaScript dialects, but CoffeeScript did at one point have a tagline of "It's just JS," just like TypeScript does now. And Dart is also a language that's just obviously very, very, very similar to JavaScript. Elm is a totally different language. I mean, it's as different to JavaScript as Ruby is, or Python is, or Kotlin. It's just its own language, and it just happens to use JavaScript as a compilation target so that you can build web apps with it. So Elm's tagline is a delightful language for building reliable web apps. And it's really just honestly totally changed my perspective on web development. Ever since I got started with it, I've really just totally fallen in love with it and just never wanted to go back to using JavaScript anymore. And at this point in my career, I think it's safe to say that I'm probably just never going to take a JavaScript job ever again because I've just become so spoiled by Elm. And in a good way, I mean, it's just become such a positive experience. And now there's so many companies that are using Elm that, I have the option that I could do that with the rest of my career if I want to. It's just been such a wonderful experience for me that I have grown in the community and sort of taken on this role of an educator. So I've done, like you mentioned, the course on front-end masters. I've taught lots of in-person workshops. I spent, at this point, more than 100 hours just standing in a classroom, in different classrooms, of course, teaching people Elm in person. And of course, the book, Elm in Action.
Yeah.
Not to mention blog posts and libraries and stuff like that. So yeah, that's kind of how it fits together.
Yeah, and you mentioned your experience teaching in workshops in different places. How has your experience teaching in person affected the way that you approach writing a book?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I guess the main way that it helped is just getting to see what kinds of things trip people up and what kinds of things people figure out on their own. Something that I've learned, especially in a workshop format, is that when you have a limited amount of time to teach people, it's not only important what you include, but also it's important what you leave out, because it's pretty easy for people to get overwhelmed with lots of new information. So the more things that you can cut out and just have confidence that people will figure them out on their own, or the compiler will help them out, or it's something that they don't need to learn right now because they can just Google it later. The better the learning experience is going to be. And I think that does translate pretty well into a book context, in the sense that although you don't have as hard a time constraint as you do with an in-person workshop, you do have the constraint that, people's time is limited. People don't necessarily want to keep going with a book that's too slow paced. So I think that's helped me understand what are the things that I can leave out of the book and say, or maybe just make a little aside that's like a sentence or two about, by the way, there's this other thing, but we're not going to get into that now. As opposed to, having lots of digressions about things that before I did the workshops, might not have realized were things that, I didn't need to include.
Yeah. It's so easy to get bogged down in the details, especially when you're an expert at it and you want to explain it to somebody.
Yeah.
So I want to get into a little bit about, how did you first hear about Elm, and what were you doing before, and what attracted you to it?
Yeah, sure. So before I heard about Elm, I got into programming at a young age, like lots of people. And when I was working professionally, I was sort of doing full stack web development. I'd done like some client side stuff in the past, I guess I had decided at the point where I found Elm that I wanted to sort of focus on front end and building web app UIs. And at the time, my preferred language of choice was CoffeeScript, because in like 2011, 2013, that was like a very popular language. Not so much anymore, but at the time it was. And I found out about Elm because by coincidence, I was in the market for a language that was just like Elm, because I had this friend who was a coworker of mine, and he sort of, his name is Deech, or Aditya Siram is his name, but he goes by Deech on Twitter. He basically sort of opened my eyes to this world of functional programming and introduced me to like Lisp and Haskell and all these languages that I hadn't heard of before, where previously I was sort of like, well, I know CoffeeScript and JavaScript and Java and Perl, and I didn't realize how similar all the languages I'd used before were to one another, and that there were other languages that sort of were different in ways that I didn't realize could be different. And so he'd sort of convinced me that, in particular, Haskell was worth my time to try out. But I wanted to focus on web app UIs, and there was really no viable way to compile Haskell to that at the time. There was GHCJS, but it had pretty well-known performance problems that meant that I didn't really want to get invested into it and then just find that the app was not going to work out. I don't know if that's still true, but it was true when I was looking into it. So around the same time, React came out, and I started using React and using it at work, and I really liked it. And so I was getting excited about PureScript, which was sort of positioning itself to be checking all the boxes of what I was looking for based on my conversations with Deech. But it didn't quite yet have a virtual DOM story like React did. And so I was sort of cheerleading. There's like some GitHub comments of me on early like PureScript React repos, just like commenting like, hey, I don't know enough Haskell to contribute to this, but I'm really pulling for you. But while I was waiting for that to happen, Elm, which actually had been around for a while, but if you looked at the Elm website at the time, it was all like game demos. It was all like 2D graphics or 3D graphics, and it was not really
on the web.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was all browser stuff. It was like Canvas and WebGL. So they had like the Mario demo and the like other Mario themed demos like Thwomp. But I remember looking at it and being like, well, this seems like at a language level, it does the type of stuff I want, but I couldn't really use this to build the type of applications that I want to build. But that was only true temporarily, because while I was waiting for PureScript to get a virtual DOM library, this blog post came out called Blazing Fast HTML in Elm. And it essentially announced the release of the Elm HTML library, which was a virtual DOM for Elm. And not only that, but it was actually building on some of the optimizations that David Nolen had come up for with ClojureScript and Elm, and basically use that same kind of optimization technique to make something that was outperforming React and outperforming Angular and Ember and like all of the big frameworks of the day. And so I was like, wow, not only is this not a performance concern, it seems like it's actually a performance benefit. So I finished the blog post and kind of pretty soon thereafter decided that I was going to give it a shot. And I decided to rewrite my side project that I'd been working on, which was previously a React app in Elm. And just had an amazing experience. Just totally fell in love with the language and never looked back.
Nice. Yeah, I've heard a little bit about that side project you were working on, where you were writing a novel and you wanted some software
to
help you with that. Are you still writing novels?
No, I mean that's kind of the irony of it is I was writing this novel. Initially I started out doing it in Google Docs, and then I found that as it got longer and longer, it was like causing Google Docs to kind of choke on the file size. I also don't know if that's still true, but it was true at the time that it was a serious performance problem. Mm-hmm. And so I started looking around, okay, like what kind of novel writing software is there? And I found that there was nothing that really kind of fit the bill of what I was looking for. So I decided, well, I'm a programmer, I'll scratch my own itch. And I started making my own app. And I used it a lot. I wrote tens of thousands of words in that, in the JavaScript version, and another tens of thousands of words in the Elm version. But what happened was that I just started just getting so into Elm, and eventually I spent less and less time on writing, like novel writing, and more time on writing Elm, to the point where eventually I just kind of put the novel back on the shelf, and I really haven't touched it in several years. I got like 80,000 words, and I have a friend who like really wants me to finish it, and so I feel like I owe it to him to finish it, because he's like the number one fan of the novel.
Nice.
But I mean, I really don't have any regrets, because I've just been like, the outcome has been so overall positive for me. I mean, I guess the biggest irony is that I started and then finished another book, namely Elm in Action, while pausing the book that got me into Elm in the first place.
Yeah, I've had another guest on the show before who's a software engineer who writes novels, and he's written some software to help him write novels. Nice. But it's more about helping people read the novel.
Interesting.
So you can kind of see where they stop reading, and so maybe that's a boring part or something.
Well, I mean, that is definitely interesting. I would have definitely appreciated getting like heuristics on that, assuming people are okay with having that data collected about them. But I was actually more interested in helping myself organize things. Like I found that, similar to programming, like once a code base gets past a certain size, it gets really hard to keep everything in your head, in one person's head. And I mean, the same is true of a novel. Like once it gets past a certain amount of point, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Like, has this, like, I'd go in and try to make a refactor. I'd be like, well, okay, I want to change this thing to happen in this scene, because otherwise it's going to mess things up like 6 scenes from now. And I'd be like, wait. Now, has this thing been introduced yet? Or is it not going to make sense when you get there? You know, when you read this part, like, have I no longer set something else up? Like, did I break something? And so answering questions like that, one of the fundamental ones was just sort of balance. Like, are the chapters like, a reasonable length, or is one of them like, way longer than the others? And I wanted to have a faster way to answer that question than just like read the entire chapter and see how it feels, to decide where to move things around. So yeah, more on the editing side than the creating side than the reading side.
I feel like I'm like you. I would never be able to write a novel, because I'd always want to write some software to help me write it.
I feel you.
So let's get into Elm a little bit. Some of the details about Elm. It's purely functional. What does that mean exactly?
So all Elm functions are pure, which means that if I write an Elm function, I have a language level guarantee that if I call that function passing the same arguments, it will return the same answer, and it won't do any side effects. So that's true of every single Elm function in the whole language. The obvious question that comes after that is, well, hang on, if every function is pure, then how do you do anything? It's actually kind of funny to me that this question persists, because I mean, we have, like, at work, we have about 400,000 lines of Elm code, running in production, which we've been building up since like 2015. And it's been going great. We have like millions of users, and it's a very well exercised, well battle tested code base. And it's like, obviously, we do effects, like we talk to servers and all sorts of stuff like that. But the short answer is that essentially, I like to use the analogy of promises in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, that's kind of the preferred way to do asynchronous effect chaining. Like you make a promise and then you can chain it together with other promises. And in JavaScript, right when you instantiate a promise, it immediately runs the effect that you requested. Like if you do a fetch, like right when you make that promise, it'll immediately do the fetch. So in Elm, we have a thing called task, which is a lot like a promise, but the only difference is, or the main difference, is that right when you instantiate the task, it doesn't run the effect yet. But rather you have these functions that sort of chain them together and then return them. And then at the end of the day, you have a runtime, like the Elm runtime, which automatically takes all of these composed together tasks and runs them all for you. So as an Elm author, I don't write any functions that are not pure. Every function that I write is pure. Some of them will return a task or a related thing called a command. But that's just a data structure that's sort of describing what I want done. And at the end of the day, it's the runtime that takes care of executing things, much like the JavaScript runtime takes care of details like memory management and so forth. The Elm runtime takes care of not only memory management, but also when to run effects. So we call it managed effects instead of side effects. But it feels about the same as using promises, to be honest.
Okay. So that applies for getting user data, fetching data from an API, or displaying something in the DOM?
So Elm's built-in virtual DOM, you don't actually need to use like side effects for that. So like in React, you need to imperatively say like, render this, React component into this DOM element.
So like in React, it would be one place in your app usually where you say that.
Right. So instead of there being one place where you say that, like by convention in Elm, it just literally is like right when you start up your program, you like give it the ID that you want to like render everything into, and then that's a prerequisite of starting up your Elm app is providing that one element, and then Elm's like, cool, I'm going to render everything into there. So yeah, I mean, pretty similar, just a different API, really.
Cool. And then what are some differences or similarities with JavaScript?
Similarities, I would say a lot. Like if you're writing a functional style of JavaScript, I would say you'll see a lot of similarities. So you'll see like immutable data, like everything and all values in Elm are immutable, and also const. So it's as if you didn't have a let or var keyword, you only had const. And if you had every value that you created was immutable, like deeply immutable, like you could not mutate it and affect other things. Which if you're writing a functional style JavaScript, you're probably trying not to do.
But Elm, you're using self-discipline.
Right. So in Elm, there is no need for discipline because it's just built for that. And similarly, like instead of avoiding side effects, you just have all the APIs are designed around managed effects anyway. So you're all set there too. So putting all those things together, those create like some level of familiarity with what you might be familiar with if you're doing like a functional style JavaScript. The main difference would be that the fact that you have these as guarantees rather than things that you're doing with discipline, it's not just that you don't have to be as disciplined, and it's not just that like every package in the entire package ecosystem, because Elm of course has its own package manager, which in my opinion or my experience is much nicer than NPM. I actually had to do some like stuff with NPM recently, and I was like, oh god, why? But it's not just that those things are easier, but also it's that, and this is the part that I didn't realize was like out there until I actually tried it and got a feel for it personally. It's that it unlocks all of these additional things, like all these amazing experiences, especially around refactoring and code maintenance, that I just didn't really have any concept of until I had sort of experienced them, because they're just not at all possible in JavaScript, functional style or not. Things like, I guess the long and short of it is like whenever I'm making changes in Elm, if I want to move a chunk of code around, or I want to change like how some big part of my application works, pretty much no matter how invasive the change is, after I'm done moving stuff around, once it compiles again, I expect it to work with no regressions, and that's normally what happens. Like it's very, very rare that after I make a small or large change in an Elm application, after it compiles again, that it does not just work without any regressions. But I mean, if that ever does happen, it's this like sort of shocking thing where I'm like, wait, it didn't work. What? Like,
that's weird.
But it compiled. I'm not saying it never happens. I mean, it definitely does happen. But it's so rare. Whereas in JavaScript, I mean, and maybe, there are TypeScript experts who are out there who are like, oh yeah, this is totally how it is in TypeScript. But I've never heard anyone say that. And the people I know who do TypeScript at work and Elm on the side are like, yeah, this is not even close. It's like Elm is completely different than TypeScript. It's really just, my experience with JavaScript was almost the opposite, where like, I mean, after I've gotten it to compile, like I usually expect that something is still broken and I need to go fix more stuff. So it's hard to sort of convey that without, I don't know, unless you've experienced it firsthand. But it really feels like a superpower. Like it feels like I'm doing just less work as a programmer. It feels like I've just like offloaded this chunk of toil to the compiler. That's just not my responsibility anymore. It's really liberating.
And do you need to write less tests in Elm?
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I used to test in JavaScript where it's like, it's not actually possible. Like, it's not possible to write the Elm test because the test would not compile. Like, if you tried to break your program in that way, the compiler would catch it. So you can't even write a test that attempts to reproduce the thing that's broken in JavaScript. It's not even reproducible.
Gotcha.
Just the compiler just catches that for you.
That's great.
Not everything. Like, I mean, I did like make the main testing library that everybody uses, Elm test. So I definitely am a big believer in tests, but I'm also a big believer in, not writing useless tests. And I like that Elm makes a lot of tests, effectively useless by catching the problems, earlier in the pipeline.
Gotcha. Yeah. What about runtime errors with Elm?
So for a long time, I used to be able to say, we have never gotten a runtime error in production in Elm. And then in 2018, we got our first one. Basically, so the Elm APIs are designed to make it is possible to get a runtime exception in Elm, but it's also extremely rare. Like I used to have fun at like the early Elm conferences. I just like, so back in like, I don't know, 2016, maybe 2015. So certainly in 2015, there weren't that many companies using Elm. It was like a pretty like hobbyist kind of a thing, community wise. Now it's like, lots of people are using it at work. But back then it was like kind of exciting when we had like the first Elm conference. And I remember asking all the other speakers like, hey, are you using Elm at work? And it was, at the time, it was only like 50-50. Now it's just like everybody. But those who were using it at work, I'd ask them like, hey, have you gotten any runtime exceptions yet in production? And they'd be like, no. Every single one of them, including us at work at the time, like nobody had gotten a single runtime exception in production. And the reason for that is just that the compiler is really, really good at catching these things. And the APIs are all designed to work in concert with the compiler to help you find stuff earlier in the process than that. And specifically like the compiler finding like type mismatches and stuff. Part of this is that Elm doesn't have null or undefined. So that whole category of things is just gone. Like you don't have null errors or, undefined is not a function. That's just impossible to have in Elm. Another part of it is that like the APIs in general try to like prioritize explicit error handling in a way where you sort of like can't forget to do it, which is also nice because it sort of surfaces points where maybe like by default your users would get a bad experience, but the fact that you're sort of like reminded like, oh yeah, there's a potential deviation from the happy path here, is a nice reminder to try and like handle that gracefully and show your user like a helpful error message instead of just like blowing up and the screen just like goes blank or like the rendering freezes. So yeah, I mean, for a long time we had that until finally we did get our first one, and it was us like, I mean, the specific thing that happened was we had a drop down, and we had a pattern match on like looking at the name of the drop down element that came back. So like, we had this explicit list of like things in the drop down that, there are these hard coded strings of like, depending on which element you selected. And we thought, well, there's no possible way that we could get anything other than one of these strings. So we just wrote an explicit, this is not part of Elm anymore, but at the time there was a thing called debug.crash, which was intended to be used when you're like, well, the original intent of it actually was for prototyping. That's why it was in the debug module. It wasn't supposed to be used in production, but we did it anyway. And lo and behold, somehow at some point we got a string in there that was not one of the ones that was in the original dropdown, which theoretically is impossible, but our theory was that somebody had like a malicious browser extension or something that was just like spamming all the event handlers with like, garbage strings trying to trigger something. That's the only thing we could think of. And somehow because the string that came in was empty string, which for a drop down event, like that should never happen. But anyway, so in the current release of Elm, that's like you when you do a production optimized build, like it gives you an error if you're still using the debug module anywhere, because it's just intended for debugging and development. Yeah. So we wouldn't have been able to do that thing that we did that triggered our first runtime error. And maybe we'd still have a clean record at this point, but the point is, yeah, I mean, in that same time, we've logged, tens of thousands of JavaScript runtime exceptions from our legacy JS, and the stuff we did before Elm. So it's not that we're like perfect programmers or anything. It's just, that's just a normal experience with Elm is tends to not crash.
The thing I love about that story is it's not that you one time had a certain kind of runtime exception that was happening a lot. It was literally one user, one time.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because we've actually had conversations about this where like we're not sure if we should keep our generic, like this is actually a debate we've recently had at work, whether we should keep our generic like runtime exception handler activated in our front end, because honestly, the entire amount, like anytime anyone goes through to triage those errors, it is always either something from our legacy JS where we're like, we know about this, but like it's just like never getting prioritized to touch that because it's like on this old page and, we're probably going to rewrite it in Elm at some point anyway. Or, and this is like almost every single one of these. I mean, it's like overwhelming majority. It's just some browser extension doing something bad. Like it's trying to hit some like Russian domain, because it's like malware, or it's like doing something where it messes with the DOM and breaks something else, so like, and honestly, we're just like, what value are we getting out of this? Like, it's not telling us about like anything that we didn't already know, like, and it hasn't in a couple of years. So should we even leave this on? I don't know. I mean, we haven't decided, but at the same time, it feels like kind of scary to lose that insight. But we are spending a lot of time like just not getting any value out of it. So it's kind of hard to justify.
All right. If someone is considering using Elm on a side project or at work, where is Elm not a good fit?
So the main thing that comes to mind is if you very specifically are trying to stitch together a bunch of like JavaScript libraries, like precise JavaScript libraries. Like I know one company was using Elm, and then they ended up switching away to ClojureScript actually, because ClojureScript has very seamless JavaScript interop, because ClojureScript is not a pure language. It's not pure functional. It's sort of a functional programming style for sure, as languages go, but it doesn't have that purity restriction that Elm has, which means that in the middle of a ClojureScript function, you can just call a JavaScript function like it's nothing. It's like very, very seamless interop. Whereas in Elm, if you want to talk to JavaScript, you kind of do it in this sort of like, you can think of it as like client server, or maybe as like pub sub, like event style, where you basically say like, hey, JavaScript, I'm sending you this message that says like, I want you to do this thing. And then JavaScript, on the JavaScript side, you have like an event list, and it's like, oh, got it. Elm wants this thing. I'll go do it and then pass the value back. So there's more overhead there, which, is actually, from my perspective, quite a nice thing, because although it is more overhead, which, nobody likes overhead, it keeps this very strong separation between the JavaScript world and the Elm world. And it really helps us narrow down problems, because if we ever get like, in our logs, like undefined is not a function, we always look at it's like, where did that come from? Oh yeah, it came from the JavaScript side, no problem. So the fact that those can't sort of like blend together and obscure where like the sources of those errors are coming from is really nice, because they're, the JavaScript rules are very different. But this company that I know, what they were building was specifically a tool where their users would integrate lots of different plugins, like arbitrary JavaScript plugins, into their app. And so that having that additional friction when like mainly what they were doing was stitching together JavaScript stuff was like a big pain point for them, understandably so. That's kind of abnormal. Like it's not normal that's like what, like most web apps are not doing that. So I'm very comfortable by default recommending Elm to basically everyone. But But if you're doing something specifically like that, or like another example would be if you need to do something that, I don't know, uses like very heavily uses web APIs where Elm doesn't have first class support, like WebRTC. I might think twice, but I would honestly probably still use Elm unless it like that integration was really sort of pervasive like throughout the app. Because I definitely know people who have done stuff with Elm and WebRTC. They just, for the WebRTC part of it, they had to use JavaScript interop. So yeah, I think like the sort of the theme here is that the more that you specifically need to integrate with the JavaScript ecosystem as opposed to just sort of building your own app, or using off the shelf stuff. Like Elm definitely has its own package ecosystem, but of course it's not as big as NPM. Like NPM's the biggest package ecosystem in the world. There's really no competing with that. If you know that like most of your time is going to be spent just stitching together off the shelf stuff, as opposed to like building your own application, sort of custom to your problem domain, then yeah, like why bother? Might as well, if it's going to be that quick, just slap together the MTN things, call it a day. But again, I think most people who are building web applications the biggest problem they have is actually like dealing with the complexity and like long-term maintenance of a lot of like stuff that they wrote in-house. And that's where Elm shines.
Do you use Elm for just quick prototypes?
We do now, yeah, at work. Like I haven't actually had a web app front end side project since Dreamwriter, where like it would have made sense to use any like Elm or JavaScript or anything. Ironically, most of my side projects since then have been CLIs for Elm, like just Elm tooling. But yeah, at work we also prototype in Elm. I would say like when I first got started in Elm, I still felt the most comfortable just using jQuery for prototyping, because I'm old school enough that I remember when jQuery came out. I learned JavaScript in like 2000, I just felt like I was the most productive just slapping these together with jQuery if I knew I was going to throw it away anyway. But these days, honestly, I don't even feel more productive in jQuery or React or anything JavaScripty than I do in Elm. So I'll just make it in Elm from the get-go.
Yeah. And what if you're making like kind of a static site generator type thing? You could, if it's very static, you could do HTML, but what if it's like generated? Does Elm have something like that?
Yeah, it's called Elm Pages, and it's a static site generator where you write Elm. I haven't used any static site generator, including Elm Pages. I just haven't had a static site to maintain in a long time. But so I know the people who made Elm Pages, and they tend to make very good stuff. So I would recommend checking it out, but I don't have any firsthand experience with it.
Yeah. You mentioned the package library, and it's not as big as NPM, but NPM is huge. So how is the Elm package library doing? Like how big is it? What kind of stuff's in there?
That's a good question. I don't know what the stats are. I know that it's like thousands of packages, but I don't know how many thousands. My general experience with it has been that if you're trying to do a particular common thing, more likely than not, there's a package for it, but there may not be like 10 different ones to choose from, which actually can be kind of nice, but also like can be not nice if it's like the one that you pick is like, well, this doesn't quite do it the way that I wanted it to do it. The other thing about it is on average, my experience has been that the packages in the Elm package repo are very high quality compared to like NPM. Like in NPM, I spent a lot of time sort of sifting through like cruft, and maybe that's just because like there just are fewer there, but it's not like there's a lower number of packages and the quality is on average the same as NPM. I would say that the quality on average is a lot higher and there is a lot fewer packages. So like, for example, there are two different charting libraries that I know of in Elm. One's made by Tereza Sokol, who's my coworker. The other one's called Elm Visualization. And both of them are like really nice, but they have pretty different like design philosophies. So Elm Visualization is kind of more in the spirit of D3, where it's like just like a very like large variety of different visualizations and like highly customizable. Whereas Tereza's library is a lot more focused on like helping you do a really good job. So she spent a lot of time like looking at like Edward Tufte and like what are the visualization best practices and how can I design the library that makes it easy for you to like do a good job making effective visualizations. So on the one hand, it gives you less control than Elm Visualization, but on the other hand, it also makes it easier to like sort of follow best practices if you don't already have like a really strong preference for like exactly how you want to do those things yourself. So I think that those two libraries are pretty good examples of the types of things that you get in the Elm package ecosystem, where like usually if there already is a really good thing, the only reason somebody will make a different thing is if they think they can have a pretty different take on that same thing. And that's kind of generally been my experience with it. So I've been a lot happier dealing with the Elm package ecosystem than the NPM ecosystem. You also don't get all these like security warnings about like prototype pollution because that just doesn't exist in Elm. You don't have like vulnerabilities to like worms that can spread through install scripts because Elm doesn't have that either. There's just a whole bunch of stuff that I don't have to worry about, which I really appreciate.
Nice. Yeah, that's impressive that she focused on Edward Tufte's or Tuft. I don't know how you say it.
I think it's Tufte. I could be wrong.
Yeah, because I've looked at his book. That's not light reading.
Oh yeah, well he's got 4 of them, I think.
Okay, I've looked at one of them.
Yeah, he has at least 4 because I own them. But I definitely appreciate both approaches because sometimes like your boss is like, make me a pie chart, and you're like, no, but pie charts are better for spatial understanding humans. But it's like, no, I gotta have a pie chart. So Tereza's library does not have pie charts, but if your boss says make a pie chart, you gotta make a pie chart. What can you do?
And what is the Elm community like? Where do people go to talk and ask questions? And what's that like?
Oh yeah, great question. So I would say that the 2 places that I would recommend first and foremost would be Elm Slack and Elm Discourse. So I think actually both of those, if you go to elmlang.org/community, just verified this right now. Yes, those are the first 2 things that are linked to in the Elm community, elm-lang.org/community. There are also like Reddit and there's a Twitter account, and there are lots of Elm meetups, or at least there used to be before the pandemic. Actually, like it's like one of the main things that I miss is like pre-pandemic. I because I live in Philadelphia, which is only like a 2-ish hour bus ride to New York. I used to go to the Philly Elm meetup, which I run, and the New York Elm meetup every month, which is nice. But now not so much. There are also Elm Conferences, which again, pre-pandemic, like we had 4 Elm Conferences in 2019. And there was going to be Elm Japan for the first year in 2020, but it got canceled as did all the other ones, sadly. But that's, hopefully they'll be coming back after all of this, whenever this changes, this whole situation. But yeah, as far as like looking for a way to meet up with people, I would go to Slack first because people are just like super friendly, super helpful. And I think you just get a nice sense of like the warmth of the community and how welcoming it is on Slack. Discourse, I think, is a good place to like have discussions like of a more long form nature, and like ask, beginner questions, but you can kind of do beginner questions on Slack just as easily, except you'll get a faster answer probably. And there's a whole like beginners channel on Slack that is full of just incredibly wonderful, helpful people. So yeah, I think those are ordered properly. I would say Slack first, and then Discourse if that's your thing.
Cool. All right. How would someone start using Elm at work? What's the best approach to that if you're currently using JavaScript?
Yeah, so definitely the most successful approach that I've heard, and this is how we did it, and it's how most of the success stories I've heard, except for consultancies, have done it, is incrementally. So consultancies, sometimes they can do a greenfield project if like a client's like, I don't care what you make this in, just make it, and then you're going to maintain it. And there's Amitai Bernstein has given some talks about. He gave a talk at Elm Europe, like what was it, 2017 maybe, called like Elm from the CTO's perspective, and he kind of just basically explained like how his consultancy uses Elm as a competitive advantage. But But I think the most common method is not greenfield. The most common method that leads to a successful outcome is doing it incrementally. So just starting, like, pick one page and something just lowest stakes possible, just absolute minimize risk, minimize risk, minimize risk, and just be like, we're going to take this one page and we're just going to rewrite part of it in Elm. We're going to implement like part of this like new feature in Elm. And the key thing is to just make it like the smallest, simplest, most basic project you can, but get it all the way into production. So the nice thing about this approach is it has two really good properties. One is that as you get it all the way into production, you have to solve all of these things that are sort of like coming up for the first time. Like, oh, how do we integrate Elm into our build process? How do we like deploy the Elm app alongside our JavaScript stuff? You get all that sorted out. And then now your next Elm project can be something incremental on top of that. And it's not as like big or as scary. You can just be like, oh, we'll just build on the infrastructure we already set up to do this really small thing. And, you know, the next project will just get to reap all the benefits and won't have any more setup work to do. And the second thing, and the more important of the two, is that because it's really small and really low risk, if it doesn't go well, you're not under like all this pressure to like, oh my God, what do we do? What do we get ourselves into? If it doesn't go well, you can just be like, okay, well, never mind. We'll just back it out and, you know, go back to what we were doing before. And, you know, it's like, how much time did you really lose on this one small thing? So it makes the stakes a lot lower. And that means that it's just like a lot more appetizing. So the problem with, like, in contrast, waiting for a greenfield project is that it's like, okay, so we've got this big new feature. We're going to do it in Elm. So it's going to be really great and amazing. Well, now let's say you get partway into this project and it's like behind schedule because you're using this language for the first time and nobody's like ramped up on it. Or maybe it turns out there were some unexpected difficulties in getting it into your integration. And like now this big high profile, high stakes project is behind schedule and people are like, what are you doing? Have you considered just not doing it in Elm? Like how long would it take if you just scrapped it and rewrote it in the thing that everybody on the team already knows, right? So it's kind of like a recipe for failure almost, where it's like it's not really setting up for success as the default outcome. It's setting up for a lot of risk and so for failure as the default outcome. Whereas the incremental approach is just like it's this harmless little thing. You know, and that's what we did. We just started out with one part of one page, which is absolutely a way you can use Elm. You know, just embed it in one section of the page. Users won't care that part of your page is done in Elm and the rest of it's in React or whatever else. I mean, I know people who've done this with React, with Angular, with Ember, with Vue. Yeah, I mean, I think people have done it with every combination of things now, the major frameworks, and then just let it grow. You know, if that one project goes well, then try it again on the next project and try expanding that and expanding that. That's what we did, and we started out with an app that was 100% React. I guess not 100%. We had some like legacy stuff, you know, like from the pre-React days too, but Sure. And then it just grew, and eventually it just became, you know, everybody, like anytime anyone wanted to build a new thing, they're like, well, obviously we'd use Elm for this new thing. And so the Elm side of the code base just grew and grew. And now we just have this tiny amount of legacy React, and everything else is in Elm. And it all just started from, you know, one small low risk project. And that seems to be the recurring success story that we hear.
Nice. Yeah. I was a consultant at a place one time and they're like, hey, we're going to use Elm for everything going forward, or a lot. We're going to use it for a lot of things. And I helped write one small form in Elm. Super small project, like a week or less. And that was kind of it. It went to production and moving on. We're not going to use Elm anymore. But that code's probably still there. Sure.
Yeah, and like that can happen, right? There's so many different reasons that technologies like do or do not turn out to be the right fit for an organization. And I think that it's sort of like presumptuous to assume that like just because like one person on the team has a really good experience that's just like going to translate automatically to everybody else. Like one of the things that I've learned is like programmers have preferences, you know, and it's fine. It's just the way of the world. Like a technology that I love and I'm super productive with, somebody else might try it out and be like, you know, I see there's something here, but like it's just not for me. Or like you know, it's too different from what I'm used to. And also organizations have different needs. Like sometimes it might be like, hey, maybe this technology is better, but like we don't have time to ramp people up. We got these deadlines we got to hit, and like, you know, we can't pause for making technical investments right now. There are just so many reasons that I think it's best to just, you know, not put yourself in a position to overcommit.
Yeah. And what about from the employer side? What are the benefits for employers to use Elm or not?
I mean, there's the main, like, number one, far and away biggest benefit is hiring. I would say, like, I mean, there's definitely the technical benefits of, like, things are easier to maintain, and like the code's more reliable, it doesn't crash as often. But for us, I mean, that was the transformational thing, to be honest. And I think that's, I guess I'm like kind of giving TypeScript a lot of credit here. I don't actually like really use TypeScript, so I don't really know, like, I'm assuming that it makes the JavaScript like reliability stuff a lot better. But I don't really personally know how much better. I just know, like, the people I know who use both, like, strongly prefer Elm. But let's assume that for the sake of argument, TypeScript, makes things a lot more reliable and maintainable.
Sure.
The thing is, there is a huge imbalance in the number of people who love and want to use Elm at work, like to the point where they're willing to switch jobs for it, versus the number of companies that are offering Elm positions. So that means that the number, like, whichever companies are willing to hire Elm developers, just get this, like, influx of excited, like, really I'm going to say above average to be mild about it, but, like, the people who tend to use Elm are, on average, I think, like, a lot more experienced. We can say, like, quantitatively, and also just, like, because of the Elm community's values, I think on average also, like, nicer and easier to work with than what you find on average in the JavaScript community. There's a selection bias there. So the companies that have been hiring from sort of the Elm talent pool, I think, have really benefited from this. So this is not just something I've experienced firsthand, which absolutely it is. I honestly, I said to people, I don't remember how we ever hired anyone for front end work before Elm, because we actually, I mean, literally, after me, we went 2 years before we made another front end hire. I mean, we had open positions the entire time, and our company's got a lot going for it. I work at No Red Ink, where we make software for teachers. It's like something place where you can, like, feel good, about what you're doing, and yet, and we were using, at the time, like, before Elm, it was like Rails on the back end, which, Rails was at the time quite popular, and actually. We had experience trying to hire both before and after we started using and promoting that we were using React, which, React was at the time, like, we were also very early adopters of React. And at the time, like, React was not as popular as it was now, but it was, we'd had the experience of trying to have a very vanilla tech stack and also a somewhat novel, like, JavaScript tech stack. Nothing. We couldn't find anybody that fit our needs. And then once we started advertising we were using Elm, we started getting way more applicants. And then our first front end hire after those 2 years was actually someone who wanted to specifically join the company because of Elm. And that was true of our next, like, N hires. Like, almost all of them were people who, like, were attracted to us because they wanted to use Elm. So, like, being able to post in the jobs channel on Elm Slack that you're hiring Elm developers is just a huge, I mean, it's like a cheat code for hiring. And again, this is not just me saying this. This is, like, other companies have said the same thing, who've been hiring Elm developers. And, I mean, theoretically, at some point that evens out, and like, maybe the market for Elm developers someday will be more like the market for developers in general, where it's very much like, every company is just trying to find them and can't find them. But I mean, most companies have the opposite problem, where they're just, trying to find good people, and good people are hard to find. But it's much less true if you can offer people the opportunity to use Elm at your place of work.
Yeah. So now I want to switch a little bit to the writing process, because I'm interested in that.
Sure.
You were writing in Google Docs, your novel in Google Docs, and then you tried making your own thing. What are you using today?
Well, like I said, I mean, right now for, like, novel writing, I just haven't been doing it. I've been,
what did you use for Elm in Action?
Oh, Microsoft Word.
Okay.
Not by choice. I asked Manning, like, hey, what should I write this in? And they said Word. So I wrote it in Word. That was about it. I understand that now there are more options. I mean, I think there are more options than when I started writing it, I think. I think they've opened up and, like, given more options for different formats, because Word obviously would not have been my first choice. To be honest, I would have preferred, like, Markdown or something like that, but whatever. I mean, it's, it's done now, and that's the only thing that I've used Word for is that book, and I don't think I'll use Word again.
Okay.
But
what about the code samples? How did you get those into the book? How did you make sure they were correct?
I mean, I just wrote them down separately. I guess I had a little bit of an advantage here in that because the structure of the book is about building up one big app. I basically have a Git repo, which also is like on my GitHub. You can just download it. And so as I was going through and building up each example, it was primarily about evolving this big code base over time. I would just make checkpoint. I just make a tag every time I hit like a chapter or a subsection of a chapter, and then I wherever I was, I would just copy paste them out of my already compiling working local example and just paste it into Word. So that's pretty much it.
Okay. And how long did it take you to write the book?
Start to finish about 4 years, which is about double I think the norm. I think the norm is like in the 2 years or maybe under range. I have no one to blame for that but myself. I really I had this ambitious goal of trying to build up this application from start to finish, and now I have a pretty real understanding for why most authors don't do that, which is that it turns out that anytime we were talking earlier about like refactoring prose. Anytime you make a change later on to the application, or I get to chapter 6 and I'm like, oh man, I really need this code to work in this way. Well, I need to have evolved the code in a way such that I arrive at where I need to arrive at in the previous chapter. So now I have to go back to every previous chapter and edit. And like the further and further along I get, it becomes this not quite factorial, but it's like almost like everything becomes proportional to how much I've written so far, like how much effort it is to make a change to the current code base, because I have to go back and make all previous chapters agree with that change.
Right. Did you keep track of that in Git branches or something?
I mean, I had everything in Git, but honestly, it didn't help that much because the main toil there was not so much updating the code as it was just going back and updating the written word.
The book.
Because because it wasn't just that I needed to make the code incrementally evolve to get there, but also I needed the explanations to evolve to incrementally get there. So because I'm changing the code, now I have to change the explanation for that code, and then that can break other things. And so I honestly, by the end of it, I was surprised that it all come together, because I was I had this whole here's all the things that I need to teach. I need to cover them in chapters that make sense. Each chapter needs to be about a particular thing. It needs to be cohesive, and then also I have this additional restriction that I've imposed upon myself, which through nobody's fault but my own, that also each individual chapter needs to feel like you're adding a feature from a feature request or making a change. Just as like every single chapter, starting with chapter 2, opens with there's this fictitious manager. Your manager asks you to do this, and the manager's kind of a character in the book a little bit, and so they're always asking you customers really love this thing, but we want to try and make it do this thing differently. So I had to come up with, ways to things that were kind of plausible, like something that a manager might theoretically ask you to add, so that it would hopefully feel like you're actually, building an application like you would, on the job.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a really fun way to learn a language, by going through a fictitious story and building it along with the book.
Yeah, I mean, that was the theory, and so far people seem to really like the book, so I like to think that it was all worth it at this point, in retrospect.
Yeah, I mean, that's commendable that you did it that way. It sounds really ambitious.
It was. I to be honest, I don't think I'd do it again that way, but now that I have done it, I can at least be proud of it.
So where's the best place for people to find you and your book online?
So I'm on Twitter at RT Feldman, and there's a link to the book in my profile. If you want to go, pick up a copy. The first chapter is free, so you can also just go read it and, see if you like my style. And if you like the first chapter, then, the other chapters are written by the same person. So, and also like you mentioned earlier on, I have a front end master's course. So I have a beginning Elm Workshop and also an advanced Elm Workshop. So the advanced Elm Workshop actually covers more than the book. The beginning stuff, there's a lot of overlap between the book and the beginning Elm Workshop. So if workshops, sort of a video format is more your thing, then you can kind of get the same thing on there. I also have a bunch of Elm talks on YouTube. If you just search for Richard Feldman Elm, there's lots of results about stuff I've given at Elm Conferences and other conferences about Elm, and just like a lot of hours if you're interested in all that.
And about just functional programming in general, I think.
Sure, yeah, some of that too.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, yeah, thanks for having me. This is fun.